The world sleeps. A blanket of darkness covers the land. Silence reigns, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a dog. It seems like a night like any other, peaceful, serene. But beneath the surface, something sinister stirs. A sense of unease hangs in the air, a prickling at the back of your neck. For tonight, the veil between our world and the unknown is thin. Tonight, the shadows hold their breath. And tonight, terror awaits. We crave normalcy, the comfort of routine, the familiar rhythm of our lives. But what happens when the ordinary becomes extraordinary? When the mundane transforms into the terrifying? For terror doesn't announce its arrival. It creeps in slowly, weaving itself into the fabric of our reality until we're caught in its web. These are the stories of those who dared to peek behind the curtain of normalcy. The air hung heavy in the small bedroom. The glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling cast an eerie, otherworldly light. The father, a tall man with a weary smile, stepped inside, the familiar scent of his son's laundry detergent washing over him. "Ready for bed, champ?" he asked, his voice soft, a comforting presence in the quiet room. The boy, nestled under his covers, looked up. His eyes were wide, reflecting the faint light from the hallway. A smile stretched across his face, unsettlingly wide, too wide. A shiver ran down the father's spine. "Daddy," the boy whispered, his voice raspy, unfamiliar. "Check for monsters under my bed." The father chuckled. A practiced routine. Every night the same request, every night the same reassurance. He knelt down, peering into the darkness beneath the bed. Dust bunnies danced in the faint light. "See?" he began, turning back to his son, a reassuring smile on his face. The words died in his throat. The smile on his son's face had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer terror. He stared at the bed, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. His son, his real son, was huddled beneath him, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. But who or what was in the bed? The lump shifted, the blankets rustling. A cold sweat broke out on the father's skin. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He was frozen, paralyzed by fear. A giggle, soft and chilling, drifted from the bed. It wasn't the sound of a child, it was something else, something dark. He could only watch, his heart pounding in his chest, as the figure in the bed slowly, menacingly began to sit up. The forest had become a labyrinth, each twist and turn leading him further astray. Darkness had fallen, swallowing the familiar landmarks of the trail. Panic gnawed at the edges of his mind. He was lost, utterly and terrifyingly lost. Then, through the trees, a faint glow. A flickering light, like a beacon in the oppressive darkness. He stumbled towards it, his pace quickening as the light grew brighter. There, nestled amongst the trees, stood a small cabin, its windows casting squares of warm, inviting light onto the forest floor. He approached cautiously, his hand hovering over the rusty doorknob. The cabin was old, its wooden walls weathered and worn, the windows caked with grime. It seemed uninhabited, forgotten by time and man. He knocked, a hollow thud that echoed through the stillness of the night. Silence. He knocked again, louder this time, still no response. His flashlight flickered, threatening to plunge him into darkness. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something he couldn't quite place. He tried to ignore the eyes that followed his every move, the smiles that widened as he watched. It was just his imagination, exhaustion and fear. grateful to be out of the cold. He sank onto the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The faces in the portraits loomed closer, their smiles mocking his fear. He tossed and turned each creak of the floorboards until dawn pierced through the cracks. He drifted into a fitful sleep. When he woke, the sun was streaming through the windows. The portraits were gone. The hospital hummed with a low, constant energy. The sterile scent of disinfectant hung heavy in the air, a familiar comfort amidst the constant reminders of mortality. The doctor, his mind weary after a long shift, made his way towards the staff elevator. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, the only sound besides the distant murmur of the nurses' station. He reached the elevator and pressed the down button, eager to collect the necessary supplies from the basement and be done with his shift. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, the doors sliding open to reveal a lone passenger. A woman, her face obscured by the shadows of the hallway, stood silently. She wore a hospital gown, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. As the elevator descended, the silence in the confined space grew heavier, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He risked a glance at the woman, his unease growing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was then he noticed it, the absence of a coloured wristband. Every patient, no matter how minor their ailment, was required to wear one. Green for living, red for deceased. The elevator shuddered to a halt, the doors sliding open to reveal the brightly lit basement hallway. A figure shrouded in the dim light at the far end of the corridor caught his eye. A man, his gait unsteady, limped towards the elevator. Panic seized the doctor. "Why did you do that?" The woman's voice, sharp and cold, cut through his swirling thoughts. He was trying to get on. The doctor turned to face her, his voice catching in his throat. "Did you see his wrist?" he asked, his words tumbling over each other. "It was red. He died last night." The woman tilted her head, a slow, deliberate movement that sent chills down his spine. A smile spread across her face, a grotesque contortion of her lips that revealed teeth that seemed too sharp, too long. Like this one, she raised her hand, her pale fingers brushing against his. He recoiled as if burned, his eyes widening in horror. There on her wrist, a red band. The key felt cold and heavy in his hand, a tangible reminder of his new beginning. The apartment, bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun, felt like a blank canvas, a space brimming with possibilities. Excitement coursed through him as he unpacked the last of his boxes, each item placed with care, transforming the once empty space into a home. Yet amidst the flurry of unpacking and arranging, a nagging thought lingered at the back of his mind, the receptionist's warning. Don't disturb the door with no number. He had brushed it off initially, attributing it to the eccentricities of an old building. But now, with his curiosity piqued, he found himself drawn to the hallway, compelled to unravel the mystery behind the forbidden door. He stood before it, the door plain and unmarked, blending seamlessly with the aged wallpaper. He ran his hand along its surface, the wood rough and cold beneath his touch. He knelt, his eye drawn to the keyhole, a tiny portal into the forbidden apartment. He peered through, his vision adjusting to the dimness within. The apartment was sparsely furnished, the air thick with dust and the lingering scent of neglect. Boxes lay scattered across the floor, their contents hidden from view. He scanned the room, his gaze falling upon a figure standing in the far corner. A woman, her back to him, stood facing the wall. Her skin, as pale as moonlight, seemed to glow in the darkness. She turned her head slightly, as if sensing his presence, her movement fluid and graceful. He held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't make out her features in the darkness, but he could sense her gaze, cold and piercing, boring into him through the keyhole. He stumbled back, his hand instinctively reaching for the doorknob of his own apartment. He fumbled with the key, his fingers trembling, the weight of unseen eyes heavy upon him. He slammed the door shut behind him, the lock clicking into place with a resounding thud that echoed through the empty hallway. He spent the rest of the night huddled on his couch, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. The words echoed up the stairs, familiar and comforting. "Dinner's ready?" The daughter, her textbook open before her, barely registered the call. She sighed, pushing her chair back from the desk. Duty called in the form of her mother's home-cooked meal. She grabbed her phone and headed for the door. The hallway, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, stretched before her. A hand, cold and clammy, clamped down on her arm. She gasped, a scream rising in her throat, stifled before it escaped her lips. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her mind struggling to process the impossible. Terror, primal and instinctive, surged through her veins, urging her to fight, to flee. She tried to pull away, but the grip on her arm tightened, the fingers digging into her flesh. "Shh!" A voice whispered in her ear, the sound chillingly familiar, yet utterly wrong. "It's me, honey." Her eyes, wide with terror, darted towards the source of the voice. Her mother, her face pale and drawn, her eyes bloodshot and wild with fear, stood behind her. But something was off. Her mother, her real mother, wouldn't be caught dead in the floral house dress she wore, a relic from a bygone era. And her touch, usually warm and comforting, sent shivers down her spine. The touch of something cold and lifeless. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's wrong?" "Don't go down there!" her mother hissed, her grip tightening on her arm. "Don't you hear it?" At first she heard nothing but the pounding of her own heart. Then she heard it, a low growl, guttural and menacing. It was something else, something hungry, something evil. "What is that?" she whispered. "I don't know," her mother breathed, "but it's not your father, it's not your siblings, it's something else. We have to get out of here," she whispered. Her mother nodded, her eyes darting towards the darkened staircase. The growling reached a crescendo, a guttural roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Each tale a chilling glimpse into the fragility of our reality. The mundane becomes terrifying, the everyday a breeding ground for horror. A father seeking to comfort his son finds himself face to face with an unspeakable terror lurking beneath the bed. A lost hiker seeks shelter in a seemingly abandoned cabin, only to be tormented by the watchful eyes of its former inhabitants. A doctor working a late-night shift discovers that death, once pronounced, doesn't always obey the rules. These stories, though different in their settings and characters, share a common thread, the unseen terror that lurks just beyond the veil of normalcy. It is the fear that whispers in the shadows, the unease that prickles at the back of your neck when you sense you are not alone. It is the chilling realization that the monsters we fear the most are not always the ones we can see, but the ones that hide in plain sight, waiting for the moment to reveal themselves. The man who dared to peer through the forbidden door, his curiosity leading him to a terrifying truth. The daughter, summoned by a familiar voice, only to find herself trapped with an entity that wears her mother's face. Each story, a reminder that sometimes the most unsettling horrors are the ones that unfold within the supposed safety of our own homes. These tales are not merely stories to be consumed and forgotten. They are echoes of the darkness that resides within us all, the fear that takes root in the quiet corners of our minds. They are a stark reminder that the line between the ordinary and the terrifying is often blurred, easily crossed. And as you turn off the light, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, remember these stories. Remember the unseen terror that lurks in the shadows. And remember that sometimes the most frightening monsters are the ones we create ourselves. The ones that feed on our deepest fears and insecurities. The ones that whisper in the dark, "You're next."